sort of meme about how I always start these off with Unyielding Spirit stats, but Demacia fell off hard last week, and at this point it's no longer a very interesting stat, but don't worry, I have a new card to obsess over and track the play rate of. So first off, just to let you guys know where the stats are coming from this week, we have duels over in Terra at 10, North America and Europe top 8, as well as the top 4 from the Southeast Asia duels over in Terra, because those were the only lists posted on the site. Heimerdinger Vi is broken. It's almost guaranteed to get permabanned, so you don't even necessarily have to know how to play it to bring it in a lineup, so if you're not a fan of either of these regions, I actually suggest bringing this deck, because you'll likely never have to play it anyway. Of the 20 lineups we're looking at, 14 of them included Heimer Vi, which is nearly a 75% play rate over admittedly a very small sample size, and the reason is Piltover Zon was historically split between Heimerdinger, Ezreal, and Burn, and now Burn is more or less off the table. A quick semantics note, if you haven't watched my content before, to me, Burn is direct spell damage based aggro, and aggro is unit based aggro, if that makes sense to you. So with that important distinction out of the way, it feels like the only hard matchup Heimerdinger had was Burn, as on turn 5 they can kind of wall up and never let a unit based deck touch their life total again. Only Piltover, Zon, and Noxus have good burn, arguably Shadow Isle if you want to include Prankster, but generally for a burn deck to be a good burn deck, you need to combine 2 burn regions to actually have enough oomph to make it count, and I don't think you can make a 3 burn lineup that's actually effective. And since aggro decks tend to lose to sea monsters and Frostbite as well, it's a really big risk to try and pick on Heimer Vi. It's better off just staying banned, but it's not the craziest thing in the world to not run it, which I'll get into a little bit more later. Sea monsters bring up the discrepancy card I wanted to track, Atrocity. I had mentioned in a previous tournament Tactician that Shadow Isle's regional identity felt like the Atrocity region, and with Sea Monsters taking over the Shadow Isle spot in a major way, I figured it was worth it to track the controversial Sea Monster card I am most in favor of, and of the 10 Sea Monster decks that we saw last weekend, 7 ran Atrocity and 3 didn't. I expect this trend to continue as it's a pretty non-committal card to have in there, but I did want to highlight some of the other massive discrepancies amongst Sea Monster players. So here we have Presto's lineup from the top 8, and I know that he had tested with Fresh Lobster, and if we hop over to Lobster's list that he won NA with, you'll see that the one difference is that he cut Atrocity in favor of a 3rd Thorny Toad. Then we have this list from Bruised by God, one of the better players out there. He didn't top this weekend, but I did want to highlight his list. No Vile Feasts, no Missed Calls, still has Vengeance, put the Atrocity in there in multiples, as well as Terror of the Tides, no Thorny Toads. Then we have Winding God's top 16 list, one of the better players out there. As we can see, no copies of Vengeance, nothing above Devour, so no Shipwreck Hoarder or Terror of the Tides. Once again, no Thorny Toad. Then I wanted to highlight Swim. Again, didn't do super well in the tournament, but one of the popular players out there, so I wanted to give you a rundown of like what his list had looked like. We see the return of Terror of the Tides, Shipwreck Hoarders in there. Once again, no Thorny Toad. We see Vile Feast and Mistcall, Vengeance, Ruination, to Atrocity. And finally, we have Hyped, who did perform well in this event. No copies of Vengeance or Ruination or Atrocity or Mistcall, instead going for a couple copies of Lore of the Depths. And we see a little bit more low end on the curve here from him. The general consensus that may surprise some of you is that Grasp of the Undying is universally out of these Sea Monster decks, and Withering Wail doesn't seem far behind it. This is a great example of how tournament decks differ from ladder decks, where you cut down on generically good, wide range of use cards for more streamlined answers for the narrow range of matchups you're actually going to see. If you correctly predicted that the most popular lineup would be Frostbite Control, Sea Monsters, and Heimer Vi, Grasp and Withering Wail look really bad into that. Grasp can hit Ash, but it's a massive mana commitment to lose to an Elixir of Iron or just a Hearthguard Omenhawk buff. And this is also part of the reason that we see Heimerdinger played over Ezreal by such a wide margin. The meta has fluctuated back to a point where damage-based removal isn't really working out. So, moral of the story, run 3 Vengeance in your Sea Monster deck. But actually, because I generally advocate for running the standard lineup, I wanted to give you guys some tips for the mirror that you're definitely going to run into if you take that advice. Tip number 1 for the Sea Monster mirror, I wasn't trolling when I said run 3 Vengeance. The matchup can get solely determined if one player gets to untap with a Nautilus, and the other one doesn't, so it's nice to have an insurance plan to kill their Nautilus if they see theirs before you do. And number 2, going deep faster than your opponent is a feasible plan. I wouldn't keep Thorny Toad in the mulligan, as we generally see that sit on board for the entirety of the game in these mirror matches, but Dreg Dredgers and Jettison are your friends, and mostly Maokai. He's actually difficult for the deck to remove outside of Jaw Hunters and Vengeance, and is great for accelerating deep, and a great way to snowball an advantage is to hit deep a turn or 2 before your opponent, and swing that life or board state with bigger Sea Monsters to set up for the Atrocity finish, but number 1, just run 3 Vengeance. Ash Noxus, or Frostbite Control as I've grown used to calling it, is like the epitome of a mid-range deck that beats other mid-range decks, and we are in a mid-range format. So if you were confused as to why this deck is good, there's your answer. Nothing's changed about this deck in quite some time, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I did want to note that of the 7 Frostbite control in Top Cut, there were 11 Freljord Noxus, which means the others were Vlad Sejuani and Swain Sejuani, so the regional combination as a whole leaves some wiggle room if you want to get creative with it. The baseline tools are there, and the decks are pretty different from each other, so it's cool to see what were originally the 2 least used regions find great synergies with each other specifically in a couple of different forms even. And the tip for the mirror here is that while it's called Frostbite Control, there's not actually that much Frostbite in the matchup, which means that if Ashe isn't safe to attack, for example, if the enemy board is something like an Avarosan Trapper and a Trifarian Glory Seeker, then it can take a while to level her up. Neither player is likely to level Sejuani, and that doesn't have any activators for the opponent's turn anyway, so you can kind of ignore that. But leveled Ashe is a great way to close out the matchup quickly and get through your opponent's potential board advantages. Keeping Frostbite cards in your opener helps with this, but don't keep Harsh Winds. And using them proactively helps out-tempo your opponent in this regard, even if you have to play a little risky with them. Don't be stingy with Trifarian Assessor, you never know how long your board is going to last, and look for those cool, high-value Reckoning plays. Quick patch 1.2 update on Tournament Bannerman. So Bannerman doesn't play Badger Bear anymore because Laurent Protégé trades the 1 attack for Challenger, but Grizzled Ranger is still in, and Unyielding Spirit is still in more than half the time. But Bannerman's boring, and you know all about it. There's not much left to say on it. It was just as popular in Top Cut as Frostbite Control, but Demacia was the least represented region over the weekend, showing up in only 12 of the 20 lineups. There are only 2 Lux decks that made Top Cut as well, due to Karma Lux being the deck to receive the most nerfs, and overall I think Demacia isn't in a bad spot, but it's going to take a level of innovation to bring it back. Lux definitely doesn't feel as good without Karma though, and Heimer has the Ionia region on lockdown for the time being, but I'm interested to see the next evolution of Demacia and if it's a regional combination that can fit into a tournament lineup. Burn showed up in a whopping 1 of the 20 lineups this weekend, and interestingly enough, all of the Burn decks that I saw, even that didn't top, were Teemo. I think players are still experimenting with the decks again, which makes sense. Championless Burn wasn't the most popular Burn deck from the get-go, and took a lot of trial and error from a lot of players to kind of hone in on that list. The problem that PNZ Noxus is running into currently is that Noxus has found a new home in Frostbite Control as a tier 1 deck, and of course you don't want to take PZ away from the absolute powerhouse that is Heimerdinger at the moment, meaning Burn is a pretty big commitment for your lineup and the power trade-off isn't quite there anymore. That said, Burn is a great option to punish a solved meta that it's not a part of, so if this weekend looks a lot like last weekend and people continue to gear their decks more and more for the mirror matches, Burn can have a big impact. Every other Top Cut represented deck only had 1 or 2 people playing it, with the exception of Endure Spiders that had 3. I just highlighted Burn because I know that people were going to be kind of curious where it settled after patch 1.2, but I'm not going to take a look into every one-off deck and things like that. That being said, there were a couple of decks that took some top 16 spots that I wanted to highlight because I think they might have a big splash in the meta, and I don't want to gloss over that. So last week I had mentioned how I wanted to see Harrowing Hecarim kind of make a splash, and I kind of got my wish as 2 of them showed up in the top 16 of Duels of Runeterra North America. Normally I don't touch on top 16 decks, but I'm making an exception this time because I've run into similar strategies on ladders since then, and I think it might be picking up popularity, and since it's a Hecarim based deck, which is a champion that just got a buff, it's possible that it took more than a few days to kind of nail down the finalized list. After all, at its core, the purpose of these videos is to help you prep for tournaments, so I need to tell you about potential dark horses if I think they're picking up steam. While I think the overall lists are going to look a little different than this, and may even look more like Spooky Karma than Ephemeral Aggro, Darkwater Scourge Deathmark is a very powerful combo into this meta. I had mentioned earlier that damage-based removal wasn't very effective against everything that we're seeing, and that's why Frostbite was seeing success, because we're in a mid-range meta, which means hard removal is king. Deathmark, Ruination, and Vengeance are all available to you in this deck, and Darkwater Deathmark is impossible for any of the current iterations of Sea Monsters or Frostbite to answer without Vengeance or stringing together multiple cards. I think there's a very real chance for a Shadow Isle Ionia deck to make a big wave into this meta. Maybe more Spooky Karma than Ephemeral, as I mentioned before, but conceptually it lines up well into everything that we're seeing. But most of a tournament deck's success is how well it fits into a lineup. We arguably take any Heimerdinger deck off the table with Ionia gone, and our Piltover Zon as a whole actually looks a little awkward with Shadow Isle and Ionia taken and Burn being nerfed. Frostbite Control is still on the table, which leaves you with realistically Vi Bannerman or Misfortune Scouts, or you could go with Frostbite Ezreal and TF Swain or Misfortune Scouts. Last week I had mentioned how many viable decks there were across all regional compositions, and I think this is a great deck to highlight that. I know I put these out on Fridays and your event is Saturday, which doesn't give you a whole lot of time to test, but if this is something that you've been screwing around with over the course of the week, I'd love to see you break it out this weekend. So before I get into the standard lineups, I actually wanted to give a quick shout out to Flaxu, who top 8'd Duels of Runeterra Europe, running Sea Monsters, Freljord Bannerman, and Yasuo. And I just wanted to kind of highlight this for a couple reasons. Number one, they were the only player to not run PNZ across top cut, and two, this is the first time that I can remember that I saw a Yasuo deck top, so I didn't want to just like glance over this. I did want to mention that like that was a thing that happened because I thought it was pretty cool. And now we're on to standard lineups. Last week I had mentioned that your standard would be picking 3 of these 4 decks, and that seemed to line up with reality, which means there's no reason for this to change. I also want to mention that if I were entering an event this weekend, I would likely bring something out of this lineup, though teching heavily for mirror matches. Unless I'm feeling super ballsy, then I'd go with something like this. And this is where I would usually put the second most popular lineup, but this time it's a little different. Previously, there were some general lineup strategies I would employ to build these sample lineups by sort of following a flowchart. In beta, the first question was, am I running Bannerman? And in patch 1.0, it was, what Shadow Isle deck am I playing? And I liked these because they were generic questions that you would answer right away to inform the rest of your lineup. Right now, because there are so many different decks popping up and every regional combination has at worst a tier 2 deck associated with it, it's a lot more personalized. There's not really a generic flowchart starting point, which makes it harder to predict a second most popular lineup, but also lets me take it in a different direction. The best flowchart start would be, am I playing Heimerdinger Vi? And if no, then you figure out where you're putting your Piltovers on and go from there. But if the answer is yes, there's no natural follow-up question. In beta, if I said yes to playing Bannerman, then the follow-up was, what region am I splashing into it? And then, what am I doing with my Shadow Isle? Right now, asking what you're doing with your Shadow Isle feels more like, if I'm not playing Sea Monsters, then what the hell am I doing with my Bilgewater? And the answer is likely something suboptimal or not playing it, like this. Take this lineup for example. If you play Heimer Vi, you're basically playing a 2-deck lineup, and are you sure that Endure Spiders and MF Scouts is going to be able to beat every Sea Monster and Frostbite lineup? I'm not. Playing Endure feels like it kneecaps you off of 2 of the better decks in the format, and Bannerman doesn't feel super well poised into the meta, and Endure isn't such a dominating force that it's worth sacrificing these other decks for. Does that make sense? And this last lineup was sort of to highlight what a Karina lineup would look like, since I figured I'd continue down the trend of what SI deck lineups look like, and this lineup did get Mago GX to a top 8 spot in North America this weekend. But Mago is a phenomenal player, and I'm not sure even they could consistently repeat this success with this lineup. Obviously, there are some Dark Horse decks out there that can beat Sea Monsters and Frostbite. The problem is finding 3 of them in the same lineup, which feels strange since they're both mid-range decks and should generally lose to similar things. But because it's a Conquest-style format, not every region actually has the tools to deal with these, which is mostly why I still use Shadow Isle as my focal point. Hard removal is good, but really only Shadow Isle has easy access to it. Demacia does to an extent, but I'm not here to shove my tier 4 Mage Seeker control deck down your throat. Anyway, everyone, that's it for this week. I hoped it helped a little bit. It's not as sexy as some of the stats from the past, but I think this weekend we're going to get some interesting decks coming out, and I'll have something more exciting for you next week. But until then, my name is Boulevard. Thank you guys so much for watching, and don't forget to follow my Twitter down there below from the Boulevard, so you can stay up to date on when and where I'll be casting if that's something you're interested in. My Discord is also down there below if you guys have any follow-up questions about some of the stuff that I talk about in the video, or you just want to chop it up, get some help on your tournament lineup. I'm always happy to help. And until then, thank you guys for watching, and good luck this weekend.